I came home early expecting to be taken care of. Instead, I walked in on my wife with another man, proof that my entire marriage had been a lie. But that was just the beginning of a journey that would change my life forever. I might just be the first husband in the history of disastrous marriages to actually send a thank you card to the man sleeping with his wife. But honestly, I really did. I almost never get sick, but there was a brutal strain of the flu tearing through my office, and by Thursday morning I was feeling it full force. My boss, not wanting me to infect the entire workplace, told me to head home. It was around noon when I pulled onto our street, already picturing how my wife Beth would take care of me, bring me soup, check my temperature, and fuss over me before tucking me into bed. That was the plan. But as I approached our house, I noticed a green pickup truck parked in the driveway. It wasn't a vehicle I recognized, but in that moment, I was too miserable to care. My only concern was dragging myself inside and collapsing. Since the truck was in my usual spot, I parked by the curb, then made my way through the garage which led straight into the kitchen. And that's when I heard it. Oh God. Yes, give it to me. Beth's voice, breathless and desperate. A man's low grunt followed, something incoherent but unmistakable. The door was cracked open just enough for me to see inside. They were so caught up in what they were doing, so completely lost in each other, that they didn't even notice me standing there. My reaction was strange. A part of me wanted to burst in and put an end to their little scene. But another part of me? It just felt numb. And no, I wasn't aroused. When you've loved someone for as long as I'd loved Beth, the sight of them betraying you isn't some twisted fantasy. It's pure devastation. I don't remember much of the drive afterward. I just kept going, barely aware of where I was heading. My mind was too busy replaying what I had just witnessed, piecing together all the little signs I had ignored over the years. That's when it hit me. This wasn't sudden. It had been building for a long time. I had no idea how long Beth had been cheating on me. Whether this guy was her first or just one in a long line didn't really matter, because truthfully I didn't care anymore. At this point, I suppose a little background is necessary. My name is Peter Thornhill, and at the time of all this I was 48 years old. I had been married to Beth for exactly half of my life, 24 years of what I once believed was a solid marriage. Beth and I originally met at work. We started out at the same company after college, and for a while we were on the same path. But while others climbed the corporate ladder, I somehow got stuck. I wasn't the type to cut corners or play office politics. I took pride in my work, making sure every detail was right, and I had no patience for people who took shortcuts. The irony? I became so good at my job that I was considered too valuable to promote. They needed me exactly where I was, and as a result, I watched younger, more ambitious colleagues leap past me while I stayed in place. Financially, we weren't struggling, but we weren't exactly thriving either. The house we lived in was one we had bought years ago, thinking we'd upgrade eventually. But reality had other plans. Selling it at a profit would have required repairs and updates we couldn't afford. And even if we sold it as a fixer-upper, finding something better within our budget wasn't realistic. Then there were our kids. 3 years into our marriage we had a son, Jason. 4 years later our daughter Laura was born. To say parenting was a challenge would be an understatement. Jason was the type of kid who tested every boundary, pushing limits just to see what would happen. Laura, on the other hand, had completely checked out of school, barely paying attention in class and spending more time with her scuzzy college boyfriend than hitting the books. He was one of those guys covered in tattoos from wrist to shoulder, the kind of guy no father wants to see their daughter with. As for Beth, she had been a nurse for years. Eventually, she decided that working the night shift suited her best. That meant on the days she worked, I'd come home around 5:30 to an empty house, left to deal with the kids on my own. Over time, it started to feel less like a marriage and more like a series of passing interactions. And now I knew why. Beth and I usually had dinner together before she left for work around 6:15 p.m., but beyond that, we barely spent any real time together. Our schedules clashed, and as the months passed, we grew more distant. Intimacy became rare, maybe once or twice a month, if that. On the rare weekends she was home, she had a habit of immediately starting a load of laundry, almost as if there was something she needed to clean before I could see it. Looking back, the signs of her affair were everywhere. But like I said before, it didn't really matter anymore. Let's take stock of my life at that point. I was trapped in a dead-end job in a town that had nothing to offer. I lived in a house that was falling apart but still somehow overpriced. My marriage was a joke, my wife was unfaithful, and my kids were well on their way to delinquency. Oh, and my sex life? Might as well have been non-existent. After leaving the house that day, I ended up back home later that night, finishing what was left of some soup, sipping on a Sprite and watching a football game before crawling back into bed. At some point, I glanced at my phone and saw a dozen missed calls from Beth. I just smiled to myself. Let her sweat. The next morning, I woke up feeling surprisingly better, physically at least. The first thing I did was call the office to let them know I wouldn't be coming in. My boss's secretary answered, and as soon as I explained why I was calling, she mentioned that Beth had been calling all afternoon the previous day, trying to track me down. Good. Next on my list was a little research project of my own. I had lost the phone number of the pickup truck's owner, but I still had the license plate number as well as the make, model, and color of the vehicle. A quick call to the motor vehicle department led to a very helpful woman on the other end of the line, who happily gave me the name and address of the man who had been parked in my driveway. Clark Slater. With that information in hand, I made another call, this time to a friend of mine who happened to be a lawyer. I asked for the name of the best divorce attorney in town. He didn't hesitate. Within minutes, I was on the phone with her, a no-nonsense woman who got straight to the point. I booked an appointment for 1 p.m. that same day. Now all the pieces were falling into place. I soon discovered that Clark Slater was married. That little detail made things even more interesting. I jotted down his wife's name and decided she deserved to know exactly what kind of man she was married to. I printed out a few key pictures, just enough to remove any doubt, and attached a note with my contact information in case she wanted to know more. I sealed everything in an envelope with her name and address on it, then headed to the post office, bought some stamps and dropped it in the mail. With that task handled, it was time for my appointment with Grace Shaw, my newly hired divorce attorney. I don't want alimony from her, and she's not touching my 401k either, I told her flatly. She can keep the house. The mortgage is in her name anyway and I have no interest in it. But if she sells, I want half of whatever she makes from it. Grace nodded, making notes. That sounds fair. I think that about covers it, Mr. Thornhill. You'll be hearing from me in about 3 months. That was it. Simple. My next stop wasn't home. It wasn't work either, not really. Instead, I walked into my company's human resources department and asked what it would take to file for early retirement. I had been with the company for 26 years. At this point, what was I still doing there? The truth was, I had no reason to stay. My marriage was over. My home wasn't a home anymore. Even my kids hardly acknowledged my existence. So, I did what I had to do. I gathered what I needed from the garage, tools, camping gear, anything that might be useful. Then, I went into the small office area, grabbed my laptop, and transferred important files from my home PC onto it. I carried it out to my car along with 2 boxes filled with CDs, a portable music player, books, and a few personal keepsakes. I didn't take much, just the things that mattered. The things that were mine. And Beth? Well, she finally got around to speaking to me, if you could call it that. The moment she realized I wasn't screaming, wasn't throwing things, wasn't reacting the way she expected, she crumbled. Her face buried in her hands, she sobbed uncontrollably. I just stood there watching. You remember the exact words, don't you? I asked her, my voice calm, almost detached. Oh God, screw me. Wasn't that it? She broke down even more, shaking her head, her whole body trembling. I felt nothing. Whatever brief flash of anger I'd had was long gone. What replaced it wasn't pity, not even sadness. Maybe a little disgust, sure. But mostly I felt empty. And that was the moment I knew. I didn't love her anymore. Not even a little. I just didn't care anymore. I let Beth sob into her hands while I finished packing. She could cry all she wanted, it wouldn't change anything. Once I had everything I needed, I left. The motel I'd been staying at was decent but a little pricey at $85 a night. Since I was going to be on my own for the foreseeable future, I figured I needed something more sustainable. There was a business lodging place near my office that catered to visiting professionals, offering long-term rates for about $45 a night, much cheaper than a regular motel. So I booked a room for 2 weeks. It was nothing fancy, but it was clean, had a small kitchenette, decent internet, cable access, and a large TV, complete with pay-per-view movies including some adult entertainment if I was so inclined. And yes, I did sample a couple. Not out of loneliness or heartbreak, but because why not? Beth certainly hadn't been concerned about staying faithful. A few days later, my son Jason called. Now I get why Mom's been such a wreck, he said. She's a total mess, Dad. She just sits around crying and cursing herself. She called in sick all weekend. I sighed, already irritated. Listen, Jason, tell your mother to pull herself together. If she thinks she can guilt-trip me into coming back, she's dead wrong. I've already filed for retirement, and a week from Saturday I'm gone. After that, what she does, what you do, and what your brother does, it's none of my concern. He was quiet for a moment, then muttered something about how everything was falling apart. Not my problem. In the meantime, I spoke to a few people we knew, friends, acquaintances, even a couple of Beth's co-workers. Everyone I talked to swore up and down that Clark Slater was the only man she had been with. But honestly, none of them seemed too sure. Either they had known and never said anything, or they were just as clueless as I had been. Not that it mattered. I made sure to let every single one of them know just how much I appreciated them keeping me in the dark about my wife's affair. After that, they didn't have much else to say. Then, in the middle of the first week in my new place, I got a call from Clark Slater's wife. Apparently, Beth wasn't the first nurse, married or otherwise, that Clark had managed to seduce. But she was going to be the last, at least while he was still married. I could only imagine how that conversation went in their household. That was the moment I finally lost my composure. Not out of sadness. Not even out of rage. But because, for the first time in this entire mess, I let myself feel the full weight of just how absurd it all was. I was in the middle of giving my thank you speech when, out of nowhere, I broke down. I hadn't cried in years, not for anything, but in that moment I couldn't hold it in. The weight of it all hit me at once. I was saying goodbye to a job I had given decades of my life to, and I was walking away not because I wanted to, but because of everything that had happened with Beth. I had been running on autopilot for the past 2 weeks, keeping myself too busy to actually process my emotions. But standing there looking at my colleagues gathered to honor me, it was just too much. Afterward, a few of us went out for drinks. While they had beer, I stuck with tea, and we spent hours swapping stories about the plant, the town, and each other. In the middle of all the laughter, we made time for dinner, and the night carried on in a warm, easy way. At some point, I found myself sitting next to Marcy. I had known Marcy for years, smart, funny, and always full of life. But that night, it was clear she was acting differently. She sat close, her hand resting on my thigh, then my arm. The touches lingered, enough that I couldn't tell if she was just feeling bold from the alcohol or if she was genuinely interested. By 9 o'clock, people started heading their separate ways. But Marcy stayed. "First of all, you're not fat," she said, looking at me intently. "Second, your hair makes you look sexy. Third, you're actually very good looking. And fourth, you're one of the kindest men I've ever met." I let out a small laugh, shaking my head, but she wasn't finished. "You know, you're one of the few men in that building who's never made a pass at me, or at any of the other women for that matter. And trust me, we noticed. You've always been a gentleman." "I've always been a married gentleman," I said, my voice carrying just the slightest trace of bitterness. She reached for my hand. "Look, you're leaving tomorrow. You deserve a little TLC before you go." One thing led to another, and soon we were holding each other close, moving together in perfect rhythm, lost in the moment. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about Beth. I wasn't thinking about betrayal. I was just here with Marcy, watching the anticipation on her face as she surrendered to the pleasure of the moment. I leaned back on the bed, watching as Marcy sat up, adjusting herself with slow, deliberate movements. "Thanks," I murmured. "Beth would never let me do that. She always thought it was demeaning." Marcy smirked, tilting her head. "I can see why some women might feel that way," she said. "Personally, I love it." We lay back against the pillows, catching our breath, wrapped in the quiet of the moment. There was no guilt, no regret, just a sense of ease I hadn't felt in years. The next morning, I packed up what little I had, got in my car, and pulled onto the interstate, heading west without a second thought. I didn't look back. For the first time in my life, I had no obligations. No marriage to salvage, no job to report to, no kids who needed me. It was just me, the open road, and the freedom to go wherever I pleased. I had a list of places I had always wanted to see, things I had always wanted to do, but no particular schedule. I was finally doing what I had dreamed of for years but had never been able to, whether because of money, family, or work. Now, nothing was holding me back. My first stop, however, wasn't some grand destination out west. Instead, I found myself heading toward my old hometown, drawn by curiosity and nostalgia. And, if I was being honest, by the thought of her. She had been a beauty back in high school, and time had only made her more striking. Her features had softened, gaining a little warmth, and a touch of fullness had settled in just the right places. She wasn't tall, but her thick dark hair and deep brown eyes had always drawn people in. And judging by what I had heard, she still turned heads. After 2 marriages, she had moved back home, now working as an assistant manager at a local store. She lived alone in a small, quiet house not far from her daughter. When I arrived, she welcomed me in without hesitation, and before long, we were sitting in her living room, real close, catching up on each other's lives like no time had passed at all. Dolores was incredibly understanding, not just about what had happened to me but about Beth as well. She had been on both sides of betrayal. Her first marriage had ended because she was unfaithful, but in her second, the roles had reversed, and she was the one who had been cheated on. That gave her a unique perspective, and while her insights didn't exactly make me feel better, they did help me process things in a way I hadn't before. Dinner was something special, enchiladas, tostadas, and plenty of conversation. But as the night wore on, Dolores became more than just a comforting presence. Her lips, her hands, the way she leaned in, it was clear she was acting on long-suppressed desires. She laughed a little when I asked her how long it had been since she had been with a man, but then her expression softened. "Too long," she admitted. "When I moved back here, I promised myself I wouldn't fall into the same mistakes, wouldn't let my past push me into another bad relationship. But you know how small towns are. Memories don't fade easily. If I had $1 for every time some guy from high school propositioned me in the last year, I wouldn't need this job." I grinned. "I bet none of them were me though." Her eyes met mine and she nodded. "No. And I think that's why I want you." Hearing those words from a woman like Dolores, especially after my time with Marcy, gave me a real boost, reassurance that I still had plenty to offer. She kissed me deeply, whispering in my ear, making it very clear what she wanted. And I never deny a beautiful woman what she desires. When it was over, I rolled onto my back, still breathless, then let out a deep, satisfied laugh. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't expected, pure contentment. The next morning, I packed up and set out once again. As I drove, I thought about how much had changed. It had been exactly 3 weeks since I caught Beth and Clark together, 3 weeks that had completely altered the course of my life. This trip wasn't just about getting away anymore. It was about starting over. And for the next 3 months, that's exactly what I planned to do. I wandered through the western half of the country, finally seeing places I had only read about. My first stop was Mount Rushmore, where I stood in awe of the massive stone faces carved into the mountainside. From there, I spent a couple of days exploring the site of the Battle of Little Bighorn, walking the grounds and imagining the ghosts of history lingering in the wind. Eventually, I made my way to Napa Valley. Yes, I definitely sampled some of the world-class wine before heading to Utah for several days. There was something peaceful about the open landscapes, the towering red rock formations, and the quiet solitude of the road. After Utah, I drove west to visit my aging aunt and uncle in Los Angeles. While I was there, I finally got to fulfill a long-held dream, watching Southern Cal take on UCLA in the Rose Bowl. One of the greatest rivalries in college football, played in one of the most historic stadiums in the country. The energy was electric, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of excitement, like I was really living again. I also spent a day in Venice Beach taking in the sights, mostly the countless California hard bodies strutting along the sand, dressed in barely anything. It was a reminder that life kept moving, that the world was still full of beauty and new experiences waiting to be had. With all the miles I covered, I had plenty of time to think. I started writing, just for myself at first, but soon realized I had the makings of a pretty solid book. I wrote about my journey, about why I was doing this, and about the unexpected reflections that came with life unraveling in middle age. Once I finished dealing with my last bit of business with Beth and settled down in Colorado, I figured I'd have time to polish it up properly. What I didn't know was that, as I drove east toward Colorado that Monday morning, my life was about to change again, completely. She was petite, with short, fiery red hair and the kind of soft green eyes that held both mischief and sadness. And when she spoke, it was like listening to a symphony of leprechauns. Yes, she was Irish, very Irish. She had come to the States years ago as part of one of those Riverdance-style Irish dance troupes, eventually settling in Denver. But about a year ago, she packed up and moved to Durango after calling off an engagement just 2 days before her wedding. What? Because she had walked in on her fiancé at his own bachelor party, caught him in the act with a stripper. If anyone could understand how betrayal could shake a person's entire world, it was her. And in that moment, I had no idea just how much she was about to change mine. I had spent a lot of time thinking about Beth and what she had done, but no matter how I looked at it, I couldn't reconcile her repeated declarations of love with the image of her tangled up in bed with another man. She had betrayed me, violated everything our marriage was supposed to stand for, and the worst part? I had no clue why. I had been telling myself over and over that I didn't care, that I was over it, but deep down that wasn't entirely true. I did care. Not because I wanted her back, God no, but because I wanted to understand. I wanted to know when the love we had once shared had faded, why she had thrown it all away, and what had made her feel entitled to do it. But those were questions I would never get answers to, and as time passed I realized something important. I didn't need them anymore. I had found something better. We sat in the car looking at each other for a long moment before we finally kissed. It wasn't fiery or desperate, no overwhelming passion behind it. But there was promise. During the 3 weeks I stayed before heading back home, or rather to the place that used to be home, Maureen and I went out a dozen times, growing closer with each date. She had been hurt before and I knew I had to be careful. She had every reason to be wary, to guard herself against getting attached too quickly. But as I got to know her better, I saw a side of her that most probably overlooked. Despite her past, despite the betrayal she had endured, she was still alive, still vibrant, still passionate in ways I never expected. There was fire in her spirit, a hot-blooded nature beneath the cautious exterior. And the more time we spent together, the more certain I became that she was exactly what I had been searching for, even when I hadn't known I was looking. One night as we sat together, she looked at me with that knowing, mysterious little smile of hers. "You knew I was going to say yes, didn't you?" she asked. I chuckled. "I was hoping, but I didn't know if it was my place to invite you or not." She tilted her head slightly, her smile widening. "You do realize the condo only has 2 bedrooms, right? And that's a problem, how?" I teased. She laughed, then took my hands, her deep green eyes locking onto mine. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice quieter now, more serious. Maureen didn't hesitate. "Very sure," she whispered. "I knew from the moment I met you, you were the one I had been looking for all my life." Her words hit me harder than I expected, settling deep into a place I thought had long since gone numb. "You know your heart, Pete," she continued. "You're a good man. And you deserve to be happy." For the first time in a long, long while, I actually believed it. The 4 of us spent the entire day skiing, pushing each other, laughing, and growing more comfortable in each other's company. By the end of it, we were sore and exhausted, but in the best possible way, the kind of pleasant fatigue that comes from an entire day spent truly living. That evening we found a modest little restaurant, nothing too fancy but warm and inviting. Over dinner we raised our glasses in a quiet toast, not just to the day but to us, to the partnership that was forming in every sense of the word. When we got back to the condo, I showered and settled onto the large water bed with a book I had been meaning to finish, while Maureen slipped into a long hot bath. By the time she emerged, she was glowing, wrapped in a towel, her damp hair cascading over her shoulders. She sat beside me, running her fingers absently along my arm as we talked about nothing and everything all at once. Then she leaned in. The kiss started slow, unhurried, her lips soft, teasing. When we finally pulled apart, she gave me a playful little push onto my back, then began her own slow, sensual journey. Her lips traced a delicate path from my neck to my chest, every touch deliberate, intimate. And in that moment, as she looked up at me with that quiet, knowing gaze, I realized something. This was nothing like Beth. This was real. I wanted to love this woman completely. As we kissed again, this time with more passion, I gently rolled Maureen onto her back. The sight of her beneath me, waiting with quiet anticipation, is something I will never forget. She lay there, her green eyes filled with desire, her breath coming softly as she watched me. And I took my time. This wasn't about rushing, about desperation or filling a void left by Beth. This was real and I wanted to savor every second of it. Maureen deserved that. We deserved that. Later, as we lay together, tangled in warm sheets, she smiled at me. "I understand," she said softly. I expected nothing less from her. When I returned to town, I reached out to Marcy Glover for dinner just to catch up. Over the meal, she gave me a knowing look. "I knew it wouldn't take long for someone to find you," she said. "You're too good a man to stay single for long. I'm glad you're happy." And I was. But happiness didn't erase the past. When I went back to finalize everything, I didn't stay at the house. It wasn't home anymore, and I wasn't about to give Beth any false hope that it ever would be again. I visited, sure, mostly to sort things out, but our conversation stayed polite, distant. Neither of us brought up the past, though it sat there, unspoken between us. Until it had to be spoken. One evening we sat down in the front room, just the 2 of us. I placed the divorce petition from Grace Shaw on the coffee table. Beth stared at it, her sad eyes brimming with tears. "So, I guess you've made your decision," she murmured. "I have," I said. "But I think I deserve some answers first." Beth swallowed hard, her hands twisting together in her lap. "Why did you cheat on me, Beth?" My voice was steady, calm. "I know we had problems in our marriage. But if you had just talked to me about them, if we had been honest with each other, maybe we could have worked through it." She hesitated, looking down, then back up at me. "I don't know," she whispered. You don't know? I swear, Pete, I never stopped loving you. You were always my number one. You always will be. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. I don't doubt that you think that, I said. But it's hard to believe you loved me when you were sneaking around with Clark. Especially when you kept finding excuses not to touch me. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, her shoulders sagging. For the first time since this all began, I saw the truth in her face. She had no good answer. Because there wasn't one. I may have been the number one man in your life, I said, my voice steady, but you sure spent a lot of time focused on number two. Beth flinched at my words, her expression crumbling. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, almost childlike. I'm so sorry about all of that, she whispered. I guess I just lost track of what really mattered. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The divorce was filed under the all-too-common excuse of irreconcilable differences, and in 60 days, it would be official. There was no drama, no drawn-out battles, just the quiet, inevitable ending of something that had already been over long before I caught her with Clark. I stayed a couple more days to gather the last of my things and to visit Jason and Laura. I was still concerned about Jason. His struggles worried me, but Laura at least seemed to have found her footing. She had carved out a place for herself in retail, and to my surprise, she had developed a newfound respect for me. Maybe she saw me differently now that I wasn't just dad at home, but a man who had taken control of his life. Then, on the second to last day of the year, I said my final goodbyes and hit the road, this time heading to Durango for good. That was 3 years ago. Now, my life is something I never could have imagined back then. Kyle and his wife have blessed me with another grandchild, and Maureen and I welcomed a baby boy of our own. I can't even begin to describe how much I appreciate this second chance at fatherhood. It's a gift I never thought I'd receive, and every single day I cherish it. As for Beth, she never remarried, though she dates here and there. Mostly, she fills her time with work and fixing up the house, something to keep her occupied when she's not at the hospital. We've managed to stay on friendly terms, keeping in touch now and then, mostly to talk about Jason. Unfortunately, his commitment to sobriety didn't last. Instead of pulling himself out, he fell deeper into the spiral. And though I may have moved on, though my life has taken a new and wonderful direction, that part of my past, the part that worries, that hopes, will always remain.